This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order all the cards in this video by using the link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. So far I've looked at all the non-green cards, and today we're concluding the card-by-card portion of the review by looking at those remaining green cards. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how good I think they'll be in Limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. First, I'm only evaluating these for play in Limited and not in other formats. That also means we'll only be looking at cards that are in draft boosters. These are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, so I will be wrong about some things, but I'll be providing updates about the format here on the channel as I play it more and more. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, which is today, you'll get a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the first green card in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth, which is Bag-End Porter, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 dwarf at common. When it attacks, it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. This starts out with solid enough stats, and there are enough legendary creatures in this set for this to attack as a 5/5 reasonably often. Keep in mind, being tempted by the ring usually means you'll have a legendary creature, so you could even make Bag-End Porter legendary, theoretically, so it would attack as a 5/5, and it'll even be a 6/6 or bigger a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bombadil's Song, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. It says target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains hexproof until end of turn. The ring tempts you. So when the ring tempts you, you choose one of your creatures to be a ring bearer, and that creature gets all the bonuses you've unlocked from the ring so far, because you get an emblem called the ring when you get tempted by the ring. Each time you get tempted by the ring, you move another level down, and you get more bonuses. The stats boost alone here isn't great, and that means that there are a more narrow number of creatures who can win a previously unwinnable combat with the help of Bombadil's Song. It does make up for that some by also being capable of blanking removal spells, which not all tricks can do, and you also get tempted by the ring, which is nice upside. In the end, I think you get a reasonable return on this investment, making this a pretty solid trick. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Brandywine Farmer, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/1 halfling peasant at common. When it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, create a food token. The stat line here is obviously very bad, but getting 2 food out of 1 card is a pretty nice thing in green, and especially in green-white, where you can find lots of uses for food. Even if you don't have a bunch of ways to use them, food do deliver some amount of value no matter what. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Celeborn the Wise, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 legendary creature elf noble at uncommon. Whenever you attack with 1 or more elves, scry 1. Whenever you scry, Celeborn the Wise gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each card looked at while scrying this way. Scrying is a well-supported theme in this format, especially in blue-green, and this is another pretty nice payoff for doing so. He'll always attack as a 4/4 since he's an elf and his effect counts himself, and there are going to be times where you can scry additional times to buff him, especially because his scry ability will, theoretically, allow you to find even more scry. He will largely be a hill giant on your opponent's turn, but some instant speed scry could also be interesting with him. I'm giving him a C+. Next up, it's Chance Met Elves, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 elf warrior at common. Whenever you scry, put a +1/+1 counter on Chance Met Elves. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this is another solid scry payoff. Starting as a 3/2 isn't ideal, but there's definitely a critical mass of scry in the set, so this will do a pretty good job of accumulating counters throughout the game. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Delighted Halfling, which for 1 green is a 1/2 halfling citizen at rare. It can tap for colorless mana. You can also tap it for 1 mana of any color, but you can spend that mana only to cast a legendary spell, and that spell can't be countered. This is really good. 1 mana creatures who tap for mana are incredible on turn 1, as you can quickly power out bigger things than your opponent can. And the fact that this can even fix mana for legendary stuff is pretty nice. It does have the downside that all mana dorks have, as it gets less and less useful the longer the game goes on. Still, that early game upside is worth a ton. I mean, this feels like an A when you play it on turn 1, basically. Sort of falls off from there, but that turn 1 upside is worth a lot. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Dunedain Rangers, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 human ranger at uncommon. It has landfall, and that means when a land enters the battlefield under your control, something happens. In this case, if you don't control a ring bearer, the ring tempts you. This is a solid stat line, and getting tempted by the ring when you play a land is pretty sweet. It's kind of a bummer that it doesn't trigger unless you don't already control a ring bearer, but it would probably be a little bit too good if you could just get through all of the bonuses on the ring just by playing lands, I guess. Either way, looks pretty good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Elven Chorus, which for 3 generic and a green is a rare enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast creature spells from the top of your library, and creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. If your deck has a lot of creatures in it, this looks like it's going to be pretty good. Casting things from the top of your library is always quite powerful. It effectively gives you a larger hand and lets you draw cards. Chaining multiple creatures together is especially nasty. The fact this also fixes your mana is nice, and the blue-green deck in the format is into scrying, further augmenting how good this can be. It doesn't hurt that it gives you some fixing in mana either, making it even easier to chain a bunch of creatures together. Now, it does cost 4 mana without any real immediate impact, but I think this delivers enough value to be a fairly high pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Elven Farsight, which for 1 green mana is a common sorcery. It says scry 3, then you may reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, draw a card. This is a surprisingly powerful draw spell for 1 mana in green. You get to see up to 4 cards, and you should be able to make sure you draw a creature almost every time you play this. On top of that, scrying is something you're going to want to do a lot of when you're playing green. It doesn't affect the board, but it's so cheap and it does such a good job of making your draws smoother and more consistent for very little mana that I have a hard time not giving it a C+. Next up, it's Enraged Horn, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/5 tree folk at common. It's got trample. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. A 5 mana 4/5 trample is probably a C- at best these days, but the ring tempting you does mean that at the very least you can give the horn some extra abilities or do the same for some other creature. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Entish Restoration, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. It says sacrifice a land, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, instead search your library for up to 3 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. We've seen cards like this before, and they tend to be pretty good at fixing your mana and ramping. What we haven't seen before is this power 4 or greater upside attached to it. When you can trigger that, this will be a really nice way to ramp and fix, although a lot of the time, by the time you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you won't be that interested in casting this, but there are some cheap 4-power creatures that might enable this to go off early. It does look like the kind of fixing you're going to want to pick up if you're splashing a 3rd color or going with more than 2 colors in general, and if you have some nice ramp win conditions, you probably play it as well. Worth noting, when you have a card that can search up 2 basic lands, that does potentially mean you can splash cards with double costed mana. So like if I had 2 Entish Restorations and a bit more fixing than that, and a double colored bomb that I'm splashing, you can actually do it, which isn't usually the case. Anyway, I think that makes this a C+ overall. Next up, it's Ent's Fury, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control if its power is 4 or greater. Then that creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn and fights target creature you don't control. This is a nice removal spell for green. +1/+1 and fight for 2 mana would already be in the lower range of premium removal for green. Giving that +1/+1 boost is surprisingly effective at allowing a wider range of creatures to deal with a wider range of your opponent's creatures. Then you add in this power 4 or greater upside and it gets way, way better. When you're adding a permanent counter to your creature and also making it even bigger so it fights even better, that's going to feel particularly good. Like all fight spells, it does have the downsides that they all have that most removal doesn't have, and that is that if your opponent responds with a trick or a removal spell on the creature you target, you can get utterly blown out. So you have to be careful about when you use this, and this is a sorcery, so you don't have as wide of a window as you would if it was an instant. So you got to be careful with it, but when you can cast it and you're careful, it will end up having a huge impact on the game and being a great removal spell, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Fall of Gil-galad, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says scry 2. Chapter 2 says put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. And Chapter 3 says until end of turn, target creature you control gains. When this creature dies, draw 2 cards. Then that creature fights up to 1 other target creature. This is a really strong saga. Scry 2 and 2 +1/+1 counters for 2 mana is already an amazing return on your investment, and Chapter 3 is great too. One of the problems with fighting is that sometimes your creature can't kill something without dying itself. So, the fact this draws you 2 cards when that happens is great. It helps soften the blow, and it means that using this, even when you lose your creature, is going to be worth it. Plus, obviously, the fact you put counters somewhere increases the chances of your creature being able to effectively fight. So you do need like 1 creature in play and to remain in play for this to do its thing, but that's not exactly a big ask in Limited. This delivers a pretty insane amount of value for 2 mana overall, and I think it does so much for so little that it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Fangorn Tree Shepherd, which for 4 generic and 3 green is a 4/10 legendary tree folk at rare. Tree folk you control have vigilance. Whenever 1 or more tree folk you control attack, add twice that much green mana. You don't lose unspent green mana as steps and phases end. So he counts himself with these abilities, so he'll have vigilance and generate 2 green mana every time he attacks. And a 4/10 is going to be able to attack on many boards without being too concerned about dying. You won't always have things to use that mana on, of course. That's, what can happen in Limited. But this is still a huge creature that can attack and block reasonably well while generating some additional value should you have some other tree folk around. It is expensive, and it isn't exactly a card that swings a game wildly in your favor. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Galadrim Bow, which for 2 generic and a green is a common artifact equipment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control and tap that creature. Equipped creature gets +1/+2 and has reach, and you can equip it for 2 mana. So, thanks to flash and the fact it attaches for free on entering the battlefield, this can function as a trick. The bad news is, 3 mana for +1/+2 reach and untap is not a very good rate. The good news is, that equation changes a bit when the +1/+2 and reach, as well as this equipment in general, sticks around. Still, it doesn't offer that impressive of a boost, and it's probably not a card that always makes the cut in your green decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Galadrim Guide, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/4 Elf Scout at common. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2. These stats aren't great, but there are enough scry payouts for the first copy of this to make the cut in pretty much every green deck, giving it a C. Next up, it's Generous Ent, which for 5 generic and a green is a 5/7 tree folk at common. It's got reach. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token, and it has forest cycling, so you can spend 1 generic mana, discard it from your hand, and search your library for a forest. This might be my favorite of this cycle of land cyclers. A 6 mana 5/7 with reach that gives you food isn't terrible in the late game. In fact, it's the kind of body that can help you stabilize, especially because the food can gain you life. And for grindy green decks to be successful in most Limited formats, they do need some big common creature that adds to the board and gains you life. And that's kind of the slot that this is filling. And it's great because if you draw it earlier in the game, you can always just cycle it away to grab a forest. It's still not insane or anything, but I do think the first copy of this is going to make the cut in most green decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Gift of Strands, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment aura with flash. It has enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2. Enchanted creature gets +3/+3. So you can use this as a combat trick because it has flash, and it can be pretty devastating. The stats boost is enough to make almost any creature win combat, and it of course sticks around in the form of an aura. 4 mana is a lot, but if you can kill something with it when it comes down, you're going to feel fine about that. And it also means you won't go behind on cards. Scry 2 is a nice bonus as well, just because that effect is nice to tack onto things, and obviously there's synergy in the format. All of that said, it is still highly situational and very dangerous in situations where your opponent has mana up, so I don't think it'll be that great. You'll have a narrow window to effectively use this, and that's kind of a problem, giving it a C. Next up, it's Glorfindel, Dauntless Rescuer, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 legendary elf noble at uncommon. Whenever you scry, choose one, and Glorfindel, Dauntless Rescuer gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Glorfindel must be blocked this turn if able. Glorfindel can't be blocked by more than 1 creature each combat this turn. This combination of abilities is interesting and makes Glorfindel capable of doing something in a few different situations. For example, if your opponent has a 2/2 around that you can force to block, that feels pretty good. And if your opponent can only take down Glorfindel with a double block, you can also shut that down. It gets really interesting when you scry twice in a turn, so it's a 5/4 and you can choose both, which you want to do in some situations. All that said, while the design is cool, I think it will be hard to line things up consistently with Glorfindel, especially because it demands you scry for this effect to happen in the first place, which, sure, scrying is easy enough to do, but it doesn't have a built-in scry like a lot of the other scry payoffs. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Last March of the Ents, which for 6 generic and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery. It can't be countered, and then you draw cards equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control, then put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. 8 mana is a lot, but if this draws you several cards and puts a couple of bodies on the board, that does seem pretty good. So good that this feels like it could be a really nice ramp win condition in the format. Of course, for that to happen in the first place, you have to have something with high enough toughness in play, and that is far from a guarantee. This is also a completely miserable card to have in your opening hand, but the upside is insane, and I can definitely see decks that have the ability to have a 6 or 7 toughness thing in play, cast this, and it pretty much wins them the game. It has some downsides to be sure, so I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Legolas, Master Archer, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 1/4 legendary elf archer at rare. He's got reach. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Legolas, put a +1/+1 counter on him. Whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you don't control, Legolas deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature. A 3 mana 1/4 reach isn't the worst starting point ever, especially since you can grow Legolas by targeting it with stuff. That isn't always something that comes naturally in Limited, but green does tend to be the best at that sort of thing between fight spells and bite spells and combat tricks. It's also pretty nice that he chips in for at least 1 damage every time you target something your opponent controls. This can mean picking off an X1 while removing another creature, or helping you do enough damage to finish a creature off. It doesn't seem that hard to make Legolas give you a ton of value, and he's got a fine baseline. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Long List of the Ents, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon enchantment saga, and it has 6 chapters, and they all say, note a creature type that hasn't been noted for Long List of the Ents. When you cast your next creature spell of that type this turn, that creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. This is a really cool and flavorful design, and sometimes it can give you some insane value. Imagine playing this on turn 1 with a hand that just curves out, and all those creatures happen to have different creature types. If you can do that, obviously this is going to pretty much win you the game, but the problem is, it's not going to line up that way very often, and then getting it late makes it pretty close to a dead card. It'll really only shine if you play it on turn 1 and have a handful of creatures with the right types. And I think that makes it too narrow overall. I mean, I think if you can find a way to get like 2 counters out of it, maybe it's not a disaster, but it still seems like kind of a problem. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Lothlorien Lookout, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 Elf Scout at common, and when it attacks, you scry 1. This is an awkward card because 1/3 doesn't exactly scream, attack with me. While scrying is important for green decks in the format, there are lots of better ways to do it, so I don't think this will usually make the cut unless you're desperate for synergy or 2-drops. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Mini Partings, which for 1 green mana is a common sorcery. It says search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, create a food token. This reminds me a bit of Attune with Ether, in that it offers you some really nice fixing while giving you a resource that is useful in the format. Attune gave you energy, Mini Partings gives you food. Even gaining life with the food isn't too bad, as it makes it more likely you can make it farther in the game to take advantage of the fixing. I can see this card being central to any green deck trying to go more than 2 colors. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Meriadoc Brandybuck, which for 1 generic and a green is a legendary halfling citizen at uncommon. Whenever 1 or more halflings you control attack a player, create a food token. Meriadoc is a halfling itself, so at worst it's a 2 mana 2/2 that makes a food when it attacks, and that's a solid card to have around. It gets even better when you have more halflings and food payoffs, and neither of those is a big stretch in green, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Mirkwood Spider, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 spider at common. It's got Death Touch, and whenever it attacks, target legendary creature you control gains Death Touch until end of turn. 1 mana 1/1 Death Touchers are pretty much always playable, since they're relevant all game long, thanks to their ability to trade with anything. Sometimes this will be able to grant a problematic legendary creature Death Touch, and that is some nice additional upside, although usually the best upside with a creature like this is that you just leave it back and it keeps your opponent from attacking you, so attacking with it isn't going to come up that often. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mirror Mare Guardian, which for 2 generic and a green is a common dwarf soldier. It's a 4/2, and when it dies, the ring tempts you. 3 mana 4/2s tend to be okay, and in this set there are several cards that like it when you have a creature with 4 or more power, and this is one of the earliest ways you can meet that requirement. The ring tempting you when it dies is solid additional upside too, giving it a C. Next up, it's Mushroom Watchdogs, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 dog at common. Sacrifice a food, put a +1/+1 counter on Mushroom Watchdogs. It gains vigilance until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. This looks like a nice food payoff. The Watchdogs can quickly become a problem, and the fact that they gain vigilance can really help you out in a race, and they have a reasonable enough starting point, giving them a C+. Next up, it's Peregrine Took, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 legendary halfling citizen at uncommon. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus an additional food token are created instead. Sacrifice 3 foods, draw a card. There's a lot of food in this set, as we've seen just in this video, and there's lots of payoffs for it, so multiplying them is really good. A 3 mana 2/3 isn't the best stat line, but this can not only multiply the food you make, it also gives you what is going to be one of the better food payoffs in the format. You can sacrifice 3 food to draw a card. That makes this into a really impressive value engine that your opponent's usually going to want to kill if your deck has any synergy at all. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Pippin's Bravery, which for 1 green mana is a common instant. You may sacrifice a food. If you do, target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. Otherwise, that creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. 1 mana for +2/+2 is usually a semi-passable trick, and the food upside here is very real. This can allow your creature to win combat very efficiently, and that's always what you want from a combat trick, giving it a C. Next up, it's Quick Beam Upstart Ent, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 5/6 legendary treefolk at uncommon. When it or another treefolk enters the battlefield under your control, up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. So, even if your deck has no other treefolk in it, this is a 6 mana 5/6 that can give 2 things, +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. That's enough to make the board a lot more favorable for you to attack. Even though Quick Beam has some mediocre stats, I think that Enter the Battlefield ability is enough to make this a nice card, and obviously, if you have a few more treefolk around, it gets really silly. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Radagast the Brown, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 2/5 legendary avatar wizard at Mythic Rare. When it or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is that creature's mana value. You may reveal a creature card that doesn't share a creature type with a creature you control from among those cards and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This looks pretty great. Most of the time, this will end up being a 4 mana 2/5 that draws you a card, and that's sort of the floor here. And then can potentially draw you a card for every other creature you play, and because he helps you find creatures in the first place, you can potentially start chaining them together and drawing an extra card every turn. Now, you aren't going to hit a card 100% of the time, especially because he's picky about creature types and mana value, but if you're casting things that cost 4 or 5 mana, which you're likely to do, you're probably going to end up being able to draw a card, and he's going to generate a ton of value, so much that it's insurmountable for your opponent. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Revive the Shire, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, create a food token. This type of effect usually isn't anything special, as 9 times out of 10, you'd rather just be adding to the board than casting this, and the fact that this is almost a blank card in the early game is obviously a problem. Using it to get back a bomb or some other powerful permanent is nice, and the food makes it a little more attractive, but this seems like the kind of card that just won't make the cut most of the time because it doesn't do enough, giving it a D+. Next up, it's The Ring Goes South, which for 3 generic and a green is a rare sorcery. The ring tempts you, then reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X land cards, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. Put those land cards onto the battlefield tapped and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So because the ring tempts you up front here, you will have at least 1 legendary creature, unless you had 1 creature and your opponent kills it in response to this or something. But you'll usually have at least 1 legendary creature, almost always even, and that means you'll get to grab the first land in your library and put it on the battlefield tapped. That's not great. A 4 mana ramp spell that doesn't even help you fix that consistently, because it's not like you search your library for a land, isn't really what you want to be doing in Limited, but it does get more interesting if you can have more legendary creatures. The awkward thing is, by the time you do have a bunch of legendary creatures, getting a bunch of mana is no longer going to be something you're that desperate to do. So I think you only end up playing this in some very specific legendary heavy ramp decks, and I don't think those are going to be dime a dozen or anything. So I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Shortcut to Mushrooms, which for one generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Normally, this kind of enchantment is kind of rough to get going. Sure, things you control leave the battlefield in Magic, no doubt about it, but they have to do it a lot for this to really deliver. There will be many turns when this does nothing, and the times where you do get a counter don't always make up for it. However, the ring tempting you does mean this always gives you something up front, and you can also wait to play this until your second main phase when something has already left the battlefield. It also works well with food, don't forget that. Food, sacrificing it to gain life, or sacrificing it to an effect does count as a permanent leaving the battlefield. So I think this will actually work, especially in green-white decks in the format. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Shower of Arrows, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. Destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying, scry 1. We see this type of effect all the time, and it's generally better to leave it in your sideboard. There will be opponents with enough targets for this to be nice, but against most opponents, it's going to feel like a D, but it is like a C+ out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Stew the Conies, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Create a food token. This is a great green removal spell. Sure, you have to have a big enough green creature, but that's never a huge ask. Even without the food, this would be a very nice uncommon. It's an instant, so you can find more windows to cast it than you can a sorcery speed version of this effect. I'm giving it a B. And our last green card is Woe's Pathfinder, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 human shaman at common. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and you can pay 6 generic and a green and tap it, and another target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. This is fragile and inefficient when it comes to stats, but it also fixes and ramps your mana, and in the extreme late game, it has an effect that isn't a terrible one to sink your mana into. I'm giving this a C+. So those are all the green cards in Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. While the card-by-card portion of the review is now over, there's a lot more Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth content on the way, including an archetype guide, an MTG top 10 on the format's biggest bombs, and lots of draft videos. If you want to make sure you catch those things, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the rest of the review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.